Marina. Привет.
Right, this is an awkward pause. I am sorry for it. We all have to stare at each other for a couple of minutes before everyone is in and we can start. But if we switch on all of our mics at once, the background noise will be overwhelming because it'll just overlap and we will just be hearing all the little noises on our desks, which we probably don't want to do. But it's great to see all of you, and people are still popping up. We have 21 participant now, right? 22. All right. This must be a weird site on YouTube where we are live streaming the event when everyone is in and everyone is just sitting silently and with the microphone blocked. Okay. Should we? Oh, I see. Bob Terasi is here. Great. And ChiaYin is here as well. Okay. Right. Let's give it one more minute for people to gather. Alina, and if there are people still coming in when we begin, would you mind just letting people in into the meeting?
Okay.
All right. Okay, shall we start? All right, it's 9 a.m. and I'd like to welcome you all to this online conference. It's rather unusual. This is actually the first time in my life that I'm doing a Zoom conference. I did a Zoom faculty meeting and I did a few Zoom coffees with friends, but running an online conference is something I've never done before. So please bear with us as we are trying to figure out how this all works. Before we begin, I'd like to say a couple of words because a ton of people was really involved in the organization of this event. This event did not happen as it was supposed to happen in April, face-to-face. And so many of these contributions sort of are left forgotten and unnoticed. But I'd like to thank the Friedrich Naumann Foundation in Moscow, as well as the German Historical Institute, which were co-sponsors and co-organizers of the event. But primarily, I want to thank the Institute for Social Sciences and Humanities at Tyumen University, our hosts, represented here by Elena. And I don't think Alexander Vileikis is here yet, but he might be joining us soon, as well as Katya Semushkina, who has done a lot of organization work. I also want to thank Alexander Semyonov and the Higher School of Economics in St. Petersburg, who are our partners in this adventure. And finally, and most importantly, the Journal Lab Imperial, which is the sort of the intellectual sponsor of the event, as well as the owner of the YouTube channel where the event is live streamed. Keep in mind, we are all public now, and people can see us on YouTube as we proceed. So this is what I wanted to say in terms of thanking our organizers. And I especially want to appreciate your willingness to commit to this event. This is a very unusual time for all of us. We have people joining us from the west coast of the United States and from Hong Kong. Nicola is here, right? Yeah, Nicola is here. So the time, I know the time is not convenient, cannot possibly be convenient for everyone. So I really appreciate your willingness to join us sort of in the middle, in the sort of center of Eurasia in terms of the time zones. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to what I hope will be an exciting conversation about a couple of really important topics that have recently receded in into the background in historiography. What do I mean by this? Just a couple of words introducing sort of the intellectual background for our event. Uh, you probably all are aware, since you are here, that economic history in general has been paid less attention recently than it used to be, especially in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, when it was the queen of historical sciences. And what I also find fascinating is that the two large historiographies, the historiography of economic exchange and the historiography of human diversity in the Eurasian space, have not been brought to bear on each other. They have not been in dialogue. Economists, if you talk to economists today, they'll tell you that context and region-specific economics does not exist, that economic laws work everywhere, that they are absolutely universal. This is, of course, a certain intellectual tradition that sees economic exchange as a common human experience. At the same time, we know from historiography that empires are spaces that are sort of proliferating on the management and creation of differences. And so there is a certain tension between the universalizing aspect of the way in which we look at the economic exchange and the historical material, rich historical material that is sort of brought to us through research on human diversity. How do we explore this tension? How do we understand this tension? Is there anything for us that can be productive? Is really the topic, the main sort of driving force behind this event. This is what I wanted to say by way of introducing our our intellectual agenda, and I'm looking forward to the first panel today. Now I'll have to change the hats. I'm going to give the floor to Marina Mogilner, who's going to be the chair of the first panel, and I'm going to go back to being a participant of the conference. But a couple of logistical notes. During the first panel, we will unmute the participants in the panel and mute everyone else. Once the presentations are over, the discussant talks for 10 minutes, we will open the space again for questions. In order to ask your question, please notify Marina, and Marina will recognize you, and Elena will switch your microphone on, and then you will pop up on the screen and ask the question. No, this is a little bit awkward, but this seems to be logistically the easiest way to go. Okay. Well, thanks a lot, and welcome again. Marina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sergey. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good day, good evening. It's 7:08 a.m. here in Chicago, and this is also the first time I'm chair at the Zoom conference, so I try to do my best. Just to clarify, when you have questions, if you want to ask a question, please notify me in chat, and I will see your name, so you don't have to really type the entire question. Just let me know that you want to ask a question, and I will ask Elena to put you on the screen. Okay? And I'll try to not to miss your name on chat. So our first panel today is titled Commerce and Visions of Diverse Social and Political Space. And we have three presenters. Blessy Abraham is the first presenter. She is currently at University of Edinburgh. And Blessy, correct me if I'm wrong, you are completing your PhD dissertation at the University of Delhi. Is this? Yes. And Blessy's presentation today is on protection versus preference behind the scenes of Indian tariff policy debates 1914-1924. You have from 15 to 20 minutes, so please try to stay within the time limit. Thank you.
Okay. Can I start?
Yes, sure.
I wanted to also ask, is my how can I wanted to do my PPT presentation. Is it possible for me to share it?
Yeah, you should
Yes,
be able
you
to
should.
share the screen because you have been made co-host of the meeting.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah,
Thank
I
you.
think, yeah,
Thank you
you're
so
sharing.
much. I got it. Okay. First of all, I just want to thank the organizers for giving me an opportunity to present at this conference. So basically, my work basically studies Indian tariff policy debates before 1924, which is a significant year because it's the establishment of the Indian Tariff Board. And before that, it's the establishment of the Indian Fiscal Commission in 1922. Both of these are significant because this is for the first time a very bold policy on tariff matter is taken on by the government of India. And the report basically focuses on two distinct criteria. Firstly, the desirability of granting protective tariffs for fostering industrial development in India, and secondly, with the desirability of granting imperial preference to British exports to India. Again, when we talk about imperial preference, we are talking basically that British exports to India are being taxed at less customs rate, at lower customs rate compared to exports from other foreign countries. So we see that both of these issues, protectionism and preferential tariff, is a matter of huge political controversy. And the Indian Fiscal Commission actually ends up recommending a very unique kind of tariff policy, which is known as discriminating protection, which is again very selective, restrictive tariff policy on a bunch of very selective industries. So in order to start before this, my idea is to go back a few years and actually explore this sort of prehistory of Indian Fiscal Commission and see how these tariff debates that are culminating in the years before 1922 and how all of this is influencing the setup as well as the recommendations of the Fiscal Commission. Just a brief look, previous works on tariffs have usually focused on the 1920s and the 1930s, and basically they have studied tariff as an economic tool and to see whether tariff was effective in realizing this great nationalist industrialization project within India. However, my work shifts the focus, and my work is to see tariff as more of a politically aspirational goal, which is basically being voiced by this new rising class of educated and wealthy Indians who are looking to assert Indian business presence within and outside the British Empire. Moreover, my work also combines how questions of tariffs is mixed up with questions of fiscal autonomy and being on par with dominion colonies like Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, and Australia, and how by imitating these colonies, India seeks to aspire for a more participatory role in the working of the British Empire. So I will let me start by just giving you a brief history of tariffs. In the slide, I just wanted to show you some of the focus groups that I'll be concentrating on. You have the Governor General, who is in charge of the central government in India. The Governor General is answerable to the Secretary of State, who is a member of the British Cabinet. Then you have the Dominion colonies. You have later the European and Indian business community who have vested interest in Indian commerce and trade. And therefore strong opinions on Indian tariff, and as well as the role of Indian politicians and intellectuals. Again, breakdown of the sea customs schedule. I'll be largely focusing on general import duties and but you will see there are other aspects like special import duties and export duties. So a brief history of Indian tariff. So basically, we'll just go back a few more years. So basically, Gladstonian principles of economic liberalism becomes very popular in the second half of the 19th century. And it has actually a strong influence on Indian financial policy. So in 1859, James Wilson, who is the finance member of the Governor General's Council, initiates a remodeling of the Indian financial system. So this means balanced budgets, minimum state interference, low taxation, nominal trade barriers, and taxation, especially tariff, only for revenue purposes. So what happens is that from the period from 1882 to 1894, India experiences a period of free trade with almost no general import duties. But from 1894, because of budget deficits, fall in the value of the rupee, India's home debt obligations to Britain, India is actually forced to reimpose a general import duty of 5%. And as you will see this slide, you will see that India never goes back to that pure laissez-faire trade space after 1894. In fact, it leads to a period of unintentional protectionism, which begins to foster this demand among the Indian business community group that is emerging as a benefit as a result of this unintentional protection, and they're constantly appealing to the government to give them further tariff protection. But however, the government constantly maintains this policy stance that any kind of protection is unintentional and that Indian and British tariffs are entirely free of protective motives and are imposed solely for revenue purposes. Again, staying very true to Gladstonian policies of economic liberalism. So how do we contextualize? How do we, just a brief picture. I would just like to show you how the import rate stays at 5%, increases to 7.5%. The general import duty is in light green. And you can see all of them are different kinds of import duties that are imposed on various commodities, and how you can see that over the years from the First World War onwards, there's a steady increase in the rate of duties, and it actually never comes down. And I would also like to mention how the share of customs, which is only 3% in 1890 of the total net revenue, increases to more than 1/3 of the total net revenue in 1922. And land revenue source, which is also another important source of revenue, decreases from 41% in 1890 to 24% in 1921. So again, you can see that tariff remains an important source of revenue, but again, the government policy makers are reluctant to expand it beyond its function of revenue and expand its role as a protectionist tariff. So how does Indian demand come into these discussions? So you have in 1905, the setting up of the first Indian Industrial Conference. You have the Swadeshi movement in Bengal, which is a demand for domestic production of domestic goods or Indian goods for Indian population, as well as the military success of an Asian country like Japan over Russia, which is actually giving a momentum to Indian entrepreneurship and investment. So this leads to setup of many small factories like matches, soaps, cutlery, etc. But these are not successful because of limited technical research facilities, limited state support, heavy foreign competition, etc. Though there is government support for industries at this time, it actually stays limited to industrial and technical education. And most of the approach to industrial development is mostly conservative. So in this context, the Indian business groups, the Indian business leaders, and many emerging Indian intellectuals strongly feel inspired by the works of Friedrich List in Germany, as well as looking up to countries like Germany, Austria, and Japan, who are greatly supported by state assistance in the form of duty and bounties, feel that they are being denied this right to develop, and that Indian empire interests are being prioritized over Indian interest. And so what happened? And moreover, the colonies around, moreover, the colonies, also the other Dominion colonies are free to set up their own tariff walls in comparison to India. And again, this becomes a major issue of contention. So you'll see that in 14, in order to deal with these problems, the Indian Industrial Commission is set up. Unfortunately, the Indian Industrial Commission does not include questions of fiscal policies and instead tries to plan a new industrial policy that tries to envision a new kind of industrial planning that is based on technical education, setting up of demonstration factories, but excludes any kinds of questions on protectionism. And again, you'll see that this is actually quite interesting because in a parallelly in Australia, you have a similar kind of industrial planning report being being released, which is called the Interstate Commission Report of Australia 1915. And it actually seeks to develop its industry by increasing its tariff rates to assist Australian manufacturers. So the twin policy of tariff walls and import substitution to boost manufacturing industry is actually the core argument of the Australian report. And actually this report becomes one of the primary documents consulted by the 1916 Indian Industrial Commission. So moreover, and because even when all these reports are being consulted and still no serious emphasis on protectionism is being considered, you can see that it's going to face a lot of criticism from the Indian business leaders. So you have in the 14th session of the Indian Industrial Commission by Mr. Jahangir Bomanji Petit, who is a very powerful cotton mill owner, arguing that India is like the Cinderella of the British Empire and that it is being denied rights that it so rightfully deserves. So when you have dominion colonies who can decide their own tariff walls, who can set up their own fiscal arrangements, India as a crown colony and an important market for British goods is being denied these rights. And it gets a bit sentimental, but tariff becomes more than just an economic goal. It becomes a politically aspirational goal. In that, a goal that an aspiration to see India move beyond this so-called industrial stagnancy and backwardness, and tariff as the key that will take India to a more modernized, large-scale industry, a new kind of national space that is self-reliant and that is self-reliant in its own industries. And again, the industries that are being envisioned are large-scale, heavy industries and not just small-scale cottage industries, which were the focus of the government. So in this context, I would just like to also jump I would also like to look into the imperial conferences and how the imperial preference plays an important role in these debates. Can I also know how much time I have left? 10 minutes. Okay. Just coming back to the imperial conferences, I think the imperial conference is an important space to look at the tariff debates, because again, it shifts the focus from between just India and Britain and also sees how tariff negotiations are happening between other colonies and Britain. So this is these conferences was held. They began in the 1880s, and they were usually attended by the head of the states of the self-governing colonies of Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and Canada, and South Africa. And these were also attended by the colonial secretary until it was only in 1917 that India became a full representative of this conference. Earlier, India was represented by a British minister, but in 1917, India actually had a participatory or a more of a say in the workings of these conferences. So one of the main crucial parts of these discussions were basically inter-empire trade, and big sense of worry for the UK was actually the foreign competition from countries like Germany, America, France, and Austria, who were rapidly supplanting English goods in the British colonial market. So in fact, in the colonial secretary's speech in 1897, the colonial secretary was Joseph Chamberlain. He actually emphasized on the necessity of setting up a commercial union based on the mutually advantageous arrangements between Britain and her colonies. So, in fact, he also started a party started a party called the Tariff Reform League in 1903 in UK. It wasn't very successful. In fact, it was quite unpopular, even though, it suggested the granting of reciprocal preferential arrangement to colonial products, which meant that products coming from Britain's colonies would receive lower tariff rates compared to the same similar goods coming from other parts of from parts outside the empire. Unfortunately, this again, it's not very popular because it was considered as kind of a tax on bread, because most of these goods that colonies were importing to Britain were primary agricultural goods, and to tax them in any form meant that it would create and sort of kind of artificial inflation within the British economy, and as well as lead to retaliation from other important trading countries. Moreover, many of the liberal politicians also argued that Britain's trade with Germany and Belgium was much more than all the colonies combined. So there was very little benefit in granting any kind of preferential arrangement to colonial products. But the dominions persisted with a one-way preference. They ended up giving preference to British goods in their markets. And this is very interesting, even when they are not receiving any kind of reciprocal advantage. Because the British market is extremely important for them, so Emmett Sullivan, the historian Emmett Sullivan, has argued that by taking Australia as a case study between 1901 and 1914, has studied that tariff, both protection and preference, imperial preference, became base in which these colonies began to negotiate their relationship with the mother country. So not only are they, even if these negotiations are not successful, they are still using imperial preference as an excuse to maintain that hold on the British market by constantly persisting in some kind of trade advantage, at the same time using the question of imperial preference to further increase their tariff rates on goods coming from outside the empire. So overall, they're using imperial preference to justify protectionism. This becomes an interesting way to think about how preference and protectionism are working in different way, have different motivations from both sides of the equation, and how this strategy of negotiation and bargaining is happening. So where does this put India? So again, India is a crown colony, not a dominion one. So what happens is that India is not free enough to sign its own treaties. So it cannot give reciprocal advantages even if it wishes to do so. So what happens? So this is a big ground of frustration. And you will see, like, as we saw earlier, like Indian mill owner Bomanji Petit, like, saying that this is why India is the Cinderella of the empire, because we are a useful market. We are for Britain, and we have the potential to expand into colonial markets, but we are being denied these fiscal autonomy rights or dominion status that will allow us to negotiate better trade terms. So, and moreover, in 1903, India actually tries to offer imperial preference to Britain. But then Governor General, who is in charge of the administration in India, Lord Curzon, actually says India has very little to offer, and in fact, not much to offer to the empire at all. So again, India's offer of imperial preference is rejected. As you can see in this table, Indian imports, British imports into India in 1913 is more than 60%. And it comes down to 56.7%. And in comparison, you can see that India's, I cannot see, actually you can see that India's exports to the UK and the British possessions is actually quite small, but it increases after the war. So you can see that once war begins, there is a change in the sort of negotiating space between India and Britain. So imperial preference, which is say negatively is rejected by Britain before 1914, now becomes a source of negotiation after the First World War, because a new new calculations come in, especially because Britain is in severe debt with the rest of the world, especially America, and it feels that it needs to consolidate the empire, the resources of the empire, and it feels that imperial preference is the way to consolidate these resources. So what happens is, and moreover, UK and Japan UK and Japan end up supplanting British exports in Indian markets. As you can see in the previous table, if we go down, if you see Japan and American imports to India increased from 2.5% to 5% and 3 to 8%, and they will continue to increase over the years. And again, in these tables, you can see that the British Empire imports to India, at least before 1914, is the Empire imports to India is much more than the rest of the world. Imports coming from the other parts of the world, but you'll see that the amount of imports from the other parts of the world significantly increases after the world and overtakes British imports, British and Empire imports, and so what happens is so this is again a changing economic order, and again it shifts the power balance a little more towards the side of the colonies. So again, now Britain is ready to negotiate. So in 1919 and 1921, UK in fact offers reciprocal preferential rates also to other colonies, to all goods manufactured and produced within the empire. And because it is feeling this huge threat from US and Japan supplanting British exports in Indian market, it decides to reconsider the question of protectionism and preference. So what happens is that along with that, there is a simultaneous development is the Government of India Bill of 1919, which restricts the amount of interference of the Secretary of State in all policy matters, including financial. And it says, at least on paper, that India is free to devise her own tariff arrangement according to Indian needs. But it is interesting that is when you look at the report, it also, though it speaks about a certain kind of limited protectionism, it also talks about India being ready to grant imperial preference as a gift to the UK. Because, since there is no gain or no loss, it could be seen as a gift. But again, this is interpreted as being is interpreted in the manner that that India is not actually being granted full freedom in devising her tariff arrangements, and that any kind of tariff policy that will go forward will be an uncomfortable mixture of both protectionism and preference. That means Indian interest will have to go forward by accommodating British trade interests, and somewhere they have to find this uncomfortable marriage of commercial benefit that is in favor of both the colony as well as the mother country. So I just want to conclude by just saying these three topics that I picked up. Firstly, that tariff is basically a very politically sensitive issue. Policy-wise, it's very confusing. Policy-wise, it has a very confusing stance from the Government of India as well as from Britain. But one thing is that the Government of India Act of 1919 actually opens up, even though it's very limited in its benefits to India, in granting autonomy to India, it actually opens up a space where you can think of tariff beyond revenue. You can think of tariff as something that will help protectionism. You can think of tariff in the form of preference. So it opens up a space for discussion, and 1920s and 30s is this long tail of tariff policy mashups that go on, which are not covered in this paper. And secondly, I look at industrial aspirations, how tariff for these emerging Indian capitalist groups is a way to imagine a new kind of modernization through industrialization, a new kind of self-reliant India. So it's really envisioning a kind of economic development, but also re-envisioning a role within the empire, a more autonomous role within the empire, and in fact, playing a supportive role, just like the Dominion colonies. And of course, we have looked at the colonial conferences, and we see how within these colonies, conferences, tariff, both preferential and protectionism, is becoming a matter of strategy and negotiation and bargaining, both from the mother country as well as from the Dominion colonies, and how all of this combined together can help us understand the rich prehistory of the Indian Fiscal Commission and the Indian Tariff Board, and to better able to understand this policy of discriminating protection that finally comes out of these kinds of discourses, and to better understand inter-imperial relationships and how they play an important role. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Blessy. I just want to remind the presenter that I sent you brief notices in chat. So please pay attention. When it's like 5 minutes to the end or 3 minutes, I indicate this. And yeah, so please pay attention. And our next presenter, just again, to make sure how we'll proceed. We have 3 presentations. We will have our discussant, and then we will open the floor for questions and discussion. So please keep sending me your names, and I will make sure that you get a chance to ask questions. Our next presenter is Sergey Glebov, Associate Professor, the Department of History at Smith College and Amherst College in Massachusetts. He is also the main organizer of this conference. Sergey's most recent book came out in 2017, From Empire to Eurasia, Politics, Scholarship, and Ideology in Russian Eurasianism. And today he will present part of his new and ongoing research project. The title of his paper is Goods and Bodies, Tariffs, Race, and the Invention of Chinese Commerce in Late Imperial Russia. Sergey?
Thank you. Thank you, Marina. I'm going to share a presentation, and just assuming that you know, we shared the papers, and you guys had a chance to look at some of the papers. All right, what am I sharing now? Okay, I need to be here. All right. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through some of the main topics of the paper and then focus on the last part, which is kind of a more down-to-earth sort of nitty-gritty archival evidence of the impact of this large-scale processes that I'm going to introduce first on the situation on the ground. So what I'm interested in this particular paper is the intersection, the sort of the interface between several different languages of the description of the imperial space. And these languages include this sort of the pan-imperial economic policies, such as the tariff introduced in 1891, the ideas about free trade in the imperial colonies in the Far East, the nationalizing empire, especially as it presented itself in the imperial borderland. That is the idea that somehow that imperial borderland had to be a sort of reconfigured as a space of the Russian nation. And finally, the local reactions to all of these ideas and the ways in which people sort of instrumentalize these ideas in order to secure their own advantage in economic exchange, right? And so I'll start with these 3 images. The cover of the Imperial Tariff of 1891, the commemorative arch, the triumphal arch erected in Vladivostok after the visit of the future Emperor Nicholas the second, then the Grand Duke, to Vladivostok, which is erected in sort of neo-Russian style and is a symbol of the nationalizing empire in the Far East, and the caricature of the Chinese merchant from the local press. So just following, sort of echoing what Blessy has already said, the tariffs, there are two types of tariffs, right? Largely in at least the European tradition. One type of tariff is fiscal, and its idea is, or its purpose is, to gather as much money for the treasury as possible. The other kind of tariff is the protective tariff, the one that guards the domestic industry or trade from foreign competition. And that particular idea of protective tariff goes back to the economic tradition that begins with Liszt. And in the Russian Empire, it sort of gets its own backing. By 1891, it emerges as a sort of consensus policy, at least in the imperial government, when it's introduced in 1891. I think the main argument that I want to make, and I think that reverberates with what Blessy said about the protective tariff and the British Empire, is that it was not just an economic measure that we can now look at only from the point of view of modernization and sort of, how should I put it, and the mobilization of economic resources. It was part of the language to redescribe the imperial space, and to redescribe it in national terms. Richard Workman, in particular, in his path-breaking book on the Russian monarchy, made it clear that Alexander III was introduced to the nationalizing ideas of the protective tariff, and sort of traces that particular history. We can also take a note that in the imperial borderlands, such as the Russian Far East, the notion of the protective tariff was perceived as a nationalizing measure. Dukhovskoy, for example, the general governor of the Priamur province in 1894, said that this measure is to introduce our region into the great Russian family, invoking the language of genetic relationship. Right? So the particularities of the Far Eastern situation was that in much of Eastern Siberia, we have the regime of the so-called Porto Franco. And this Porto Franco essentially established free trade along the entire coast, Pacific coast of the Russian Empire, and all the way into the continent. Sort of the customs was in Irkutsk. So much of Eastern Siberia is included in this Porto Franco. The idea behind the introduction of this regime was that there was not enough demographic and economic forces that are local in the middle of the 19th century, and you had to open that trade in order to make life possible in these territories, which were especially annexed from the Qing Empire in 1858 and 1860. Also, the treaties with China, which incorporated these territories, allowed for a 50-mile free trade exchange across the border. And so the regime of Porto Franco was attacked as early as late 1880s and discussed throughout the 1890s in the context of the introduction of the protective tariff, although it was really abolished only in 1909, then reinstituted again in 1904, and then finally abolished in 1909. And so all of these discussions were happening already in 1892-93, which will be important for my presentation later, about the meaning of Porto Franco, free trade, and protectionism in the Far East. And this is the map of the territories which I'm talking about along the border with China. Another important moment that I want to highlight for you before I move to the local reactions to the rhetoric of protective tariff and nationalized trade is the idea of race as it emerges in the late imperial Far East. And I see two sort of sources for the racial rhetoric as it comes to this territory. One sort of kind of sources is global, and this is a photograph of an American family living in Vladivostok. In 1903, they staged this photograph, which is like a reenactment of the American South, right? The white family sitting in their chairs, surrounded by quote unquote colored servants. In this case, Chinese, Korean, and Japanese servants. So there is this large mercantile community, which is very international in the Russian Far East, which serves as one of the sources of this racialized rhetoric. One member of this community, for example, was Julius Brenner, a Swiss immigrant merchant who settled in Vladivostok and built a shipping empire and became a Russian subject in 1891-92. And I could not restrain myself from saying that he was also the grandfather eventual of Yul Brynner. And here you have Yul Brynner in the Magnificent Seven in 1960. And there is a monument to Yul Brynner in Vladivostok in front of the mansion, this Art Nouveau mansion that Julius Brynner built for himself and his family. So Brynner, for example, was one of the first people who suggested to the Russian authorities in Vladivostok the international experience of segregation, physical segregation in the cities, and he was a co-author of the first project to physically separate the Chinese and Korean inhabitants of the city in a particular quarter, a project that eventually did not really lead to much, but was important as one of the sort of sources of this new racial rhetoric. And at the end of the day, the Chinese population came to be concentrated in the so-called Millionka, Chinese quarter of the city. The other kind of source of racial rhetoric in the Far East is local. Well, local or intra-imperial. It comes from the Russian Empire. Beginning in the early 1880s, there is a very significant overseas resettlement from Odessa on the Black Sea by steamers to the Russian Far East. We usually think of the Russian Empire as a kind of a continental empire, but among other things, it was also an overseas empire. Up to 20,000 peasants were resettled this way by the end of the 19th century from Odessa to the Far East. Why is this important? Is that because most of the settlers actually came from the western borderlands of the Russian Empire, and they brought with them the mental maps of the internal other in that part of Imperial Russia. And very quickly we see in the middle of the 1880s references to Chinese merchants as Jews in the Russian Far East. Right? They're referred to as Geschäftmachers using Yiddish expressions. They're referred to as kikes. It quickly makes its way into the local press. And by the end of the 1880s, this rhetoric of Chinese as Jews of the Far East is already part of the official language. It's included, for example, in the reports of the governors to the emperor. All of these things are important for us to understand this particular moment, which happens in 1891, 1894, when unexpectedly we see in the archival record a bunch of petitions from various kinds of merchants to the local authorities in the Far East. The thrust of all of these petitions is, please limit the Chinese trade in the area because we cannot deal with it. Right? For instance, on September 2nd, 1893, a group of such merchants from the town of Nikolskoye wrote to the general governor of the Priamur Krai, and they explained, I quote, that we settled here in order to pursue trade, and we had hoped that here, on the edge of our state, the trade competition should be comparatively milder than in Russia or Western Siberia, and that due to this, our labor will pay off better. However, the petitions continued, we were brutally misled, as it turned out that this land is overpopulated by the Chinese, and their competition is more difficult than that from the compatriots back home. Right? The petitioners argued that in the last 2 years alone, dozens of Russian stores had to close, and that while only 8 Russian-owned shops still remained in Nikolskoye, there were over 80 Chinese-owned shops and stalls. On November 15, 1893, a certain Paramon Bespalov, a merchant from Tula, who had arrived in Vladivostok via a circumnavigation trip from Odessa, lodged his own complaint. He explained that he had rented a stall at the market for 25 rubles a year and started his business selling manufactured goods. However, in a year's time, the Vladivostok administration opened an auction for the stalls on the market. And I quote from the petition, the manzas, which is a local term for the Chinese, brought up the price for the stall to 1,000 rubles a year. Bespalov appealed to the administration to take measures, since commerce for the Russians, he said, becomes positively impossible. Right? In another merchant, Vasily Zharikov, had arrived in Vladivostok from Nikolaevsk in 1874, which makes him an early settler. He set up 2 stores, one in the soldiers and one in the officers' quarters of Vladivostok, and began trading, with the volume of trade reaching 4,000 rubles a year just in one of his stores. However, Zharikov complained, in 1885, Chinese stores began to appear, and in 1886, the volume of his trade went down by half. He blamed the competition of 25 new Chinese stores nearby. Zharikov also blamed the local officials who allegedly helped the Chinese. There is another a merchant called Varlam Lagiev, a reservist who had settled in the local garrison and opened the store when his service was over, service in the army. He also faced stiff competition from the Chinese, and like many others, he argued that, I quote, competing with the Chinese for a private person is impossible. He blamed the fact that the Chinese could lower their prices because they did not pay the mandatory taxes and fees required of the Russians. All of these petitions stressed the particular nature of Chinese commerce, and this is what I find really interesting. At the center of this particularity of Chinese commerce was the peculiar Chinese body. As Lagiev argued somewhat vaguely in his petition, I quote, the Chinese have different requirements. Others, though, were fairly specific. For example, merchants from Nikolskoye explained that, indeed, the requirements of the Chinese are different from those of the Russians. The Chinese live here without their families. They eat the cheapest kind of food and dress in the cheapest kind of fabrics. They also live in impossibly crowded housing without any conveniences. So the merchants claimed that because of this particularity of the Chinese body, the Chinese merchants could afford to spend for food, lodging, and clothing no more than 40-50 kopecks a day, which was impossible for a Russian in need of more substantial sustenance, I suspect, and a better kind of lodging. For example, Kazimir Zhalkievsky, a second guild merchant in Vladivostok, wrote in his petition that he had to abandon his retail and focus on transportation because of the impossible competition of the Chinese. Like other merchants, he explained that it is impossible for an honest person to compete with the Chinese because a Russian, and he added, being Polish, and the European in general, but has to abandon his style of life and turn into a manza, that is, into a Chinese, to eat only vegetarian food, live in squalor, and in Chinese fanzas, that is, housing units, types of housings. All of these merchants claimed certain kind of Russianness in the face of the Chinese competition, from which they wanted to be protected. For example, the Ukrainian Fyodor Titarenko, the Jew Itzhak Mayerovich, the Poles Stavitsky and Sitkevich all pointed out their Russianness threatened by the assault of, I quote, a foreign nation, чужая нация. They did not conceptualize their belonging to the white race, but spoke in terms of Russianness or Russian subjecthood. Perhaps only the above-mentioned Kazimir Zhalkievsky, a Pole, was uncomfortable enough with claiming Russianness without qualifications and added Europeans in general as a category of difference in his complaint. Their constructions of the Chinese still operated with a fairly vague notion of difference articulated in familiar terms of Russianness as subjecthood, poddanstvo, which meant belonging to the state and paying taxes and dues appropriate for their estates. However, these merchants began to rely on the somatic elements in articulating differences. The Chinese, in their imagination, won the competition because they possessed a different kind of body, able to survive where the Russians and Europeans could not. The way of life required to sustain a Chinese body, in their minds, was no longer just a cultural characteristic, but a somatic and biological feature weaponized by the Chinese in the war for commercial domination. As was often the case in the Russian imperial administration, there is this flood of petitions to the general governor's office, and the bureaucratic machine, beginning to work. And the governor general usually would request some kind of information from experts, other officials, and so on and so forth. And so a particular report was requested from Adolf Dutton. He is pictured here on the right, in the remarkably colonial outfit, wearing the parka, who was running the Constant Albers trading retail company in Vladivostok, Khabarovsk, and other eastern Siberian or pre-Amur region cities. You have the photograph of the house here, of the trading house here on the left. Thank you, Marina. I have 2 minutes. And so what's interesting about this story is that Dutton, who is a foreign subject, also kind of produces a study of Chinese commerce, and he approaches it with a certain sort of rationality. His study is based on numbers. He studies how much the Chinese companies import, how much they spend on salaries and other expenses. And his argument is that with mathematical precision, we can conclude that there is no way to compete regularly with the Chinese commerce. The only way Russian, and of course Dutton is a Prussian, a German, who also became Russian subject very recently, a Russian can only compete with the Chinese if the state intervenes with certain kinds of rules that would limit the Chinese commerce. Interestingly, there as well, Dutton points out the particularity of Chinese body and the way in which the Chinese are able to survive on resources which are not sufficient for any European. So let me quickly conclude that this story, I think, shows us a couple of interesting things. First of all, there is a certain interface between the pan-imperial policies, such as the introduction of the protective tariff, and the reactions of local merchants, who probably caught, by reading local newspapers, by talking to officials, who probably caught this new rhetoric of protecting commerce from the foreign nation, from чужая нация. Of course, these people did not think about protective tariffs in their Listian tradition, and they did not think about the economic impact of protective tariffs. Their understanding of Russianness and the way in which these economic measures nationalized the space was probably also very different. And in each particular merchant's case, probably represented a particular set of circumstances. But we begin to see how these languages, at the pan-imperial level and the local level, begin to converge, or at least enter into some kind of communication. And that I find an important and interesting moment in the late imperial juncture at the end of the 19th century. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sergey. Now we are moving to our last presentation for today by ChiaYin Xu, Associate Professor of the Department of History at Portland State University. She recently was an editor of two very important collections. One that came out came out in 2016, The Cultural History of Money and Credit, a Global Perspective, and another one that is forthcoming, and we are looking forward to it, The Cultural Life of Risk and Innovation, Imagining New Markets from the 17th century to the present. And the title of today's presentation is Civil War Rubles in Manchuria and the Specter of the Chinese Currency Speculator. So please, Jane, you have to unmute yourself. Unmute yourself.
You're right, I forgot
Yeah,
to.
perfect, thank you.
There we go. Thank you. Thanks very much for your introduction, and thanks to Sergey, Glebov, and the organizers of the conference for inviting me. And this looks like a great conference. I'm looking forward to the rest of it. But I guess today I will present my paper, and I do have a screen to share, and I will, I guess I will find, okay. Oops. All right. Yeah. So I want to start by showing a map of the region. Okay. Oopsie. Oh, here we go. I guess I managed to share it, right?
Yes, now we can see it, yes.
Okay, slide show. Okay, yeah. So this is a map similar to what Sergey just showed about Vladivostok in the Far East, just a little bit further south below. And my paper is about the construction of the Siberian Railroad and mostly the Chinese Eastern Railroad, and how those railway constructions have enabled the Imperial Russian government to pursue a strategy of railway imperialism that included expanding the use of the ruble into Manchuria. So after the Russo-Japanese War, Southern Manchuria became a Japanese sphere of influence, but North Manchuria, especially the railway concession zone of the Chinese Eastern Railway, remained firmly under Russian influence. There, until 1914, the main trade currency of the region's exports, the ruble, which is the ruble, controlled the market without competition, according to a contemporary observer. This paper traces the ruble in the Civil War years in relation to Manchuria's local currencies and regional currencies. And this paper asks basically, how do we understand revolution and civil war as economic events, given their extraordinary and unpredictable character? And I propose the lens of monetary nationalism. It's not a perfect term because of problems associated with that term, sort of different meanings. But I use it to sort of suggest that in the Russian case, it might be called the monetary idea of empire. And this, this idea of empire offer the contemporary Russians a seemingly stable goal in a time of instability. So I also propose, in addition to the idea of the monetary idea of empire, the lens of conception of agency, in particular that of attempts to articulate agency, to attribute agency to catastrophic events, which held out the possibility that unpredictable and unanticipated changes, that is uncertainty, could be explained or domesticated. I think both types of lenses can help reveal the affective and non-calculative or ideological aspects behind economic decisions. So in a way, I'm looking for ways to think about economic events beyond a kind of economic logic. And I think in some ways, looking at the ruble in Manchuria during the Civil War can help us do that. So, okay, let's see. So, Russian and Manchuria articulated their monetary idea of empire by doing what they could do to prop up the ruble during the Civil War. Among the Russian institutions that endeavored to do so are the Chinese Eastern Railway, which sought to turn railway transport into a guarantee of the ruble's value by setting fares in rubles. Also, the Russian-dominated Harbin Commercial Exchange, the Harbinskaya Birsha, sought to maintain the ruble as a trade currency of the region during this time. And the Russian-funded Chinese language newspaper, the Yuandongbao, or the Far Eastern paper, disseminated favorable news about the ruble and disparaged the ruble's critics, again to prop up the ruble and to build up confidence for the ruble. As the ruble fell, the Russian commentators, searching for the cause of its collapse, found a culprit in the Chinese currency speculators. I suggest that in this time of war and revolution, economic and monetary prognosis, commentaries, and searches for causation regarding the ruble, even when accompanied by attentiveness to local conditions and global events, were largely based on guesswork, and that they could not be but guesswork. This guesswork, nevertheless, served to entrench certainty shaped by normative notions of monetary practice, among which was the view that the Chinese monetary practice, in particular the concurrent use of multiple currencies, promoted speculation and economic instability. So I should explain that in Manchuria this time, many different kinds of Chinese currency circulated, and it was taken basically as for granted as fairly a fairly normal situation. But in the eyes of outside observers, what is taken as a normal situation by Chinese users of different types of money is considered to be far from normal, to be a kind of economic dysfunction. So the ruin, so the fall of the ruble sort of amplified the sense that there was something wrong with Chinese currency practices. After the First World War began, the ruble's exchange rate started to fall, not only against the major foreign currencies such as the British pound, the US dollar, and the Japanese yen, but also against the myriad of Chinese local currencies such as the diao, a regional money, and the Chinese silver dollar units of Dayang and Xiaoyang, as you see here. And they're both national and cross-regional currencies. The decline of the ruble's exchange rate reflected wartime pressures. The Imperial government removed the ruble off the gold standard in 1914 in order not to have the gold drain out of the imperial coffers. The government also printed unbacked paper to pay for its wartime needs. On top of that, The wartime news of the time depressed the ruble's exchange rate, with defeats rather than victories returning to the newspapers. Finally, in 1917, both the February and October revolutions brought the ruble's exchange rate further down. The provisional government, like the imperial government, paid for its needs by printing paper money. These paper rubles acquired the nickname of Kerenki after Kerensky and Dumki after the Duma. So this is an example of a Dumki. After the February Revolution, the earlier imperial rubles acquired the nickname of Romanovsky or Romanovs. And in Manchuria, to add to the mix of the different rubles circulating, there was also the Horvatovki or Horvats, named after the director of the Chinese Eastern Railway, D.L. Horvat. And it was issued by the Russo Asiatic Bank based in Harbin, the largest city in North Manchuria. During the Civil War, Northern Manchuria, as in many parts of the former Russian Empire, as in Manchuria, as in other parts of the Russian Empire, these different paper notes circulated, and along with many local surrogates. Importantly, for Siberia and for the Far East, another type of money was added to the mix, and that was called Sibirki, or Sibirsky Znaki, or Siberians. These paper notes were issued by the provisional Siberian government based in Omsk, which became, after November 1919, after a coup, the all-Russian provisional government led by Admiral Kolchak. The Omsk government printed paper notes of close to 15 billion rubles in face value. So that's a large sum, but in fact, not as many as what the Bolsheviks were printing at this time. These notes were printed on low quality paper on one side only, using very poor quality ink, referred to as roof paint by detractors. Lacking in uniformity and crudely fashioned, according to an observer, the Sibirki in circulation were, quote, dirty, easily torn, and unsuited, quote, to inspire confidence, unquote. And they were often mistaken for counterfeits. The Omsk government at first allowed paper notes it did not issue to circulate in its territory, such as the Kerenki notes. Consisting of 20 and 40 ruble paper notes, the Kerenki were derogatorily called kvass etiquette by the general public, and they were favored over the Sibirki, but at all the same, they were favored over the Sibirki and commanded a higher exchange rate than the Sibirki. As the Bolsheviks were minting massive quantities of Kerenki, Omsk financial advisors shifted to seeing the Kerenki as a threat. In spring 1919, as Kolchak prepared to launch an all-out offensive against the Red Army in the Volga region, Omsk worried that if successful, the campaign would incorporate territories infused with Bolshevik printed Kerenki notes. So according to one observer, quote, every advance of the front throws more of this money into Siberian circulation, disorganizing exchange and drawing much needed goods out of Siberia, unquote. This placed Omsk in a strange predicament of contemplating military victory as a source of monetary and economic crisis and disarray. Anticipating this looming threat, Omsk finance minister I.A. Mikhailov ordered the withdrawal of Kerenki from circulation. Announced in February 1914, shortly after the Omsk military offensive was to begin, shortly after the Omsk military offensive began, the Kerenki's withdrawal was to be implemented in Siberia and the Russian Far East, and to be effective starting July 1919, after which point Kerenki would cease to be legal tender in these regions. Soon after its announcement, major defeats at the front ended Kolchak government's hope for crushing the Soviets, quote, like a stone under a hammer, unquote, according to a Omsk newspaper. The defeat shook market confidence in the Sibirki, and from mid-May to mid-December, the average monthly ruble to yen, Japanese yen, the ruble to the Japanese yen exchange rate in Harbin dropped from 15.5 rubles to 1 yen for 1 yen to 144 rubles for 1 yen. So this is just so that you can get a sense of that difference. So the ruble lost dropped to 1/10 of its value in 6 months. Okay. The Sibirki reached North Manchuria around March 1919, soon after the Chinese Eastern Railroad internally listed the Sibirki at the same exchange rate as the better valued Romanovs and Kerenki for the payment of railway fares, thereby establishing the equivalence of these different types of rubles. This move bolstered the exchange rate of the Omsk money through the months of April, as the Sibirki's exchange rate relative to the Japanese yen followed just behind the more preferred Romanovs and Kerenki, rather than very much behind. In early May, Omsk extended its law on the withdrawal of Kerenki to the Chinese Eastern Railway concession zone. To enforce the use of the Sibirki, the military commander of the railway zone, General Pleshkov, issued an order in early June requiring all Russian citizens, and that is Российские граждане, trades and enterprises in the region, in those concession zone, to accept Sibirki without condition and as a legal tender at their face value. The failure to do so would be punishable by 3,000 rubles in fines or 3 months imprisonment. So this is a rough progression of the chronology of how these Chinese Eastern Railways sought to prop up the Sibirki. Despite these efforts, Chinese ruble users regarded the Sibirki as the least desirable of the ruble notes. They either refused it entirely or they took the Sibirki only at a steep discount. Omsk's decision to withdraw Kerenki notes worked to push down the ruble's exchange rate in general. The ruble lost 30% of its value within 1 week of the order to to withdraw the Kerenki. Yuandongbao, the Chinese language Russian funded newspaper, pitched in to support the Sibirki at this point. To assuage Chinese ruble users who doubted the solidity of the Sibirki, the paper insisted that these stability of the Sibirki was not to be questioned. Militarily, it argued, Kolchak's Russian army was victorious at every battle, despite the contrary on the actual battlefield, and that Kolchak was forcing its enemy to retreat westward, and financially, the Sibirki was backed by Siberia's immense treasures and assets, which, according to the paper, was augmenting with each Omsk victory, as Omsk gained more territory, of course. The newspaper's reassurances probably rang hollow to many Chinese ruble users. They asked why Omsk paid for its purchases with Sibirki rather than with the gold that they possessed, because they did possess gold. And by mid-1919, they probably knew that Kolchak's army was defeated and retreating. Observers could also have picked up on other signs of Omsk's difficulties. For instance, Russian refugees from Siberia began to flow into Harbin to escape the civil war and the hunger resulting from grain requisition from all the different fighting forces. Perhaps more revealing, the Sibirki watchers saw that in May 1919, the Russian and Chinese workers of the Chinese Eastern Railway and of segments of the Siberian Railroad went on strike, demanding a wage supplement to make up for the substantial discounts that the Sibirki constantly faced when they tried to use the money. This Chinese Eastern Railway ended the strike by conceding to the workers. But in July 1919, another strike broke out, same year, 2 months later. This time, railway workers refused the Sibirki altogether, demanding that they be paid either in Romanov notes, the US dollar, or the Chinese silver dollar paper notes, the dayang. Acknowledging the Sibirki's flaws, the Russian controlled Harbin Commercial Exchange, the Harbinskaya Birja, even as it met as a committee and agreed that even though it ought to promote the Omsk ruble, it also faulted the Omsk government for failing to understand that the crudely made Sibirki, quote, provoke the mockery of foreigners, unquote. And the Sibirki's appearance in the Far East, the Harbin Commercial Exchange report concluded, worsened currency circulation and sharply increased the price of ruble of everyday prices. In other words, there was inflation. The price of goods went up in order to counter the use of general popular use of Sibirki. As the railway strike continued into August 1919, the director of the railway, Horvat, General Horvat, telegraphed the Omsk finance minister, Mikhailov. Horvat pointed to Harbin's importance as, quote, the pulse of currency circulation in the Far East, unquote, and declared that he was committed to, quote, fight to the very end and in every way possible, unquote, to, quote, maintain the dominance of our money in Manchuria, unquote. Horvat also asked Omsk for the 15 million Romanovs you promised, a sum for paying the outstanding wages for the railway workers and ending the strike. This sum, Horvat asserted, would allow the railway to, quote, hold on until the middle of September without converting the railway fares into another currency. And lacking it, we will have to borrow from the Chinese government the necessary sum in the Chinese dollar. And in order, so, unquote, in order to obtain the Romanovs required, the Chinese Eastern Railroad decided that it may have to borrow the money from the Chinese government in the event that Omsk cannot supply it with the necessary sum. Omsk, so this is the chronology of different events, starting with the telegrams, the exchange between Horvat and Omsk. Omsk reply given by the foreign minister, I.I. Sukin, concurred with Horvat's strategy to block the use of the Chinese dollar, the dayang, on the railway. Sukin reiterated that setting railway fares in a quote foreign currency, meaning the Chinese dollar, dayang, should be allowed only as a last resort, so as to prevent, quote, the complete exclusion of the ruble from the markets in Manchuria, unquote. But instead of sending the requested 15 million Romanov rubles, Omsk asked Horvat to, quote, use all your great influence in the East, unquote, to play for more time. Several days after Horvat's telegram, the Chinese Eastern Railway found that it had exhausted all the means for propping up the Sibirki. As its deficit mounted thanks to the Sibirki's falling market rate, the Chinese Eastern Railway at last questioned the viability of these notes, these rubles. Quote, in our eyes, this is according to a railway financial report, Omsk's paper notes stood for, quote, the political and economic future of Russia, unquote. And the idea of an invisible great Russia and the idea of an quote, indivisible great Russia, unquote. Thanks to these intangible events, visions that spoke to Russian idea of the future, the report insisted, the Sibirki carried an, quote, innate quality that is an intrinsic merit to that imparted value to this money, unquote. But the financial report admitted that Sibirki were subjected to sharply fluctuating exchange rates. As such, the Sibirki were unlikely to gain the same quote, inalienable innate quality in the eyes of the inarodzi, by which they mean the Chinese, and foreigners, by which they mean the Europeans, in the free market of the Far East, unquote, as they did amid Russians. Judging that the Sibirki would soon, quote, lose their right of citizenship, prava gражданства, that is membership among the monies that are used there, in a railway concession zone, they would take with them the other ruble notes, the CER report concluded. And it also hinted that the railway's task now was to abandon the Sibirki in order to save the ruble. To do so, the CER, the Chinese Eastern Railway, announced that starting November 1st, 1919, the railway would stop taking Sibirki and Kerenki notes altogether, and the railway fares and fees were to be paid only in gold ruble coins or their market equivalent in Romanovs or the Horvats, the Russo-Asiatic Bank surrogate. In practice, increasingly, the fares, though posted in gold rubles, were paid in Chinese dollars or dayang, since it was nearly impossible at this point to obtain Romanovs or Horvats.
I'm sorry, Jane, I keep sending messages. Maybe
Oh,
you
I'm so
don't
sorry.
see them. We are out of time, so you have to wrap up. Yeah, sorry.
Okay. Okay, so I would just say very quickly that, you know, basically by 1919, it was very clear that this ruble was no longer viable, and generally most of the Russians in Manchuria explained the ruble's ruin by pointing to the Chinese currency speculator, and in many ways, this is my guess is that this allowed them to identify a cause for the ruble's fall, the ruble's decline, and also locate agency in this event, when in fact there is no agency to be located. And in fact, I find I want to just end very quickly with this note that, in fact, there's a different definition of speculators that I find very interesting, that I think I'm working with and sort of I think could be applied, which comes from Frank Knight. And contrary to common sort of definitions of speculation, this one talks of speculators as people who no longer who base their actions on the exercise of judgment or opinions as to the future course of events, rather than founding it on economic knowledge. So in this case, I would say that in fact, you might say that everyone was acting in an economically uncertain environment. Perhaps everyone was acting as speculators in this sense, and in particular, the Russian the Russian authorities in Manchuria were also, in their way, trying to understand economic events, not by economic knowledge, but through a kind of conviction and feeling and exercise opinion. They too were speculating about the future and the present. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, ChiaYin. And now we move to our discussion part of the program. So I want to invite Alexander Semyonov. Sasha, please unmute yourself. Alexander Semyonov is Dean of History Department at the High School of Economics in St. Petersburg. He is also co-editor of Imperio. He has 10 minutes for his comments, and then the floor will be open for your questions and comments. Thanks.
Yes, thank you, and hello to everyone. And thanks for the organizers and Sergey Glebov for bringing us together. One correction, no longer the dean, just the chair of the department, God bless. And thank you for the organizers for providing conference water. Good. I'm not specializing in economic history. I'm not an economic historian. So it's difficult for me. But also, these are three interesting papers, and I hope they will generate subsequent discussion. What I want to do is to have general questions for three paper givers and then specific questions in the second part of my comment. And now it's 9 minutes, so I'd better go. The idea of the conference, very nicely explained and expressed by Sergey Glebov, is to put together into a conversation two different corpuses of literature, one in economic history and one aspect of that, trade, and also the literature on empire, imperial formation, as spaces of differences and mechanisms of management of difference. And I think the three papers, what they share together is that they explicitly focus on this discursive entanglement of, on the one hand, economic discourses and political visions. And the three papers, well, let me very briefly list, although you've just seen the paper, but in the way of reminding, in the case of Blessy Abraham, this entanglement is the question of the relationship of the tariff to the autonomy in decision-making within the imperial formation that we call the British Empire. In the case of Sergey Glebov, it's the decisive impact of the nationalizing empire on the emergence of the protective tariff policies and the overlap with the locally grown racial discourses that shape the assessment of the economic activity of the Chinese merchants in the Far East. And in ChiaYin, it is the perception of the symbolic standing of the ruble in the extraterritorial zone of the Eastern Chinese railroad, the connection between the power, the prestige, the influence, and the exchange rate of that same ruble. And of course, the investigation showed us how the political problems within the empire led to the deterioration of the value of the ruble, and how in the end, this is the argument of the author, the observers of this process decided to shift the blame to the speculators, and guess who they were? They were the Chinese speculators, no one else. But to me, the three papers also beg a very important larger question. And that question is that how do we think, how do we map the boundaries between the realm of the economic activity, the realm of economics, and the realm of politics? And the difficulty of this map making, as it were, is that we are, it's complicated by two factors. One is the context. And the context, the chronological period that we are talking about, Sergey Glebov talks about the late 19th century, but the rest two papers squarely addressed, situated in the early 20th century, is that, you know, we have at that moment a changing idea about state institutions, state regulation, and economic activities. And I think, you know, we are dealing with this shifting boundary of what befalls under the state regulation of the time, what is an economic activity worthy of attention of a state regulation or an institution, that changing boundary. And then we're still sort of trying to keep together economic knowledge, not much has been said on that, policies in the economic sphere, and the political visions. And the second factor that complicates this map-making enterprise is that it's not just the state. These are imperial formations, and very different ones, ranging from a colonial practices, extraterritorial government, like in the case of Manchuria, very peculiar position of the Indian Raj within the British Empire, and the situation of the collapse of the imperial space when no institution are in sight. So this is very difficult, but I think it is very thought-provoking, and all three papers basically pointed out that it's a kind of simile. It's a kind of extension of political concerns into the economic sphere, and you have this indeed interface between ideas about what economic activity is and what the political realm were about at that time. I find it interesting that with discussion of economics and the political activity, the three papers, and I was also thinking in these terms, we were often sort of trying to capture the space. What is the nature of that space that we are talking about in relationship to territory, in relationship to, you know, customs and the protective tariff, the length of the borders in which we are supposed to implement these questions, but also in relation to social activities and social groupings within that political space. And finally, I think we've heard a lot from at least the two papers, the first and the second one, about the global circulation of economic visions and political visions of imperial space and difference. So these are, I think, the sort of the big questions that that unite the three papers, and I'm sure there are more, but I would like to focus on those. And then I would like to ask specific questions to Blessy Abraham. I take, you know, it's really, you very nicely laid out the difference between the tariff policy as revenue exercise and the tariff policy as a developmental measure. And again, you know, we are in the situation when people are talking about a shifting gear of the imperial policies, the modernizing empires, the more interventionist empires. And I think this revenue versus development is a nice summation of that policy in the realm you're talking about, or in the case you are talking about. There is, in your paper, very little of the global or inter-imperial circulation of these ideas. And at least when we come to the Russian Empire, it's all about Friedrich List, Sergey Witte, and the translation and the publication and the discussion of these ideas. It seems like there is either an autochthonous discourse about this in the British Empire, or they're plagiarizing, you know, they know about that, but they are just, you know, converting it in its own term, or it's a completely homegrown discourse in terms of the economic theory or economic knowledge. I would like to ask you another question that I think is very important, and having in mind the presentation of ChiaYin soon. What is the monetary mechanisms in there? We know it's the gold standard, and we know that, you know, London is not just the capital of the British Empire, but also an important financial center. So this interesting asymmetry in this, you know, in a way, a sort of a limitation of the autonomy in favor of keeping the universal space. Are there any monetary considerations? Is there a backing up? Is the pound a reserve currency for interactions in the space of the British Empire? And then, of course, the space, this nexus of economic discourses and the political imperial discourses allows us to interrogate the space and the scale in which we situate our case. And I have a feeling that India may be too large a unit to sort of really unpack the controversies around it. Now, of course, you have to constantly move between the scales, and there is the dominion, non-dominion status that will be up until 1947, up until very late. But what is internal status of these discussions? India is a subcontinent. Some areas are very well developed. It's likely that the developmental measure implemented by the imperial center and the local imperial authority is likely to privilege one part of India over the other. What is sort of the state of conversation about heterogeneity of the Raj? And I assume you're talking about the Raj. So the princely states, I guess they are falling in terms of the economic policy and the tariff policy. I guess they are falling under the colonial office and the general governor. But if that's not right, please correct me. On to Sergey Glebov, who is, of course, the author of all our troubles, trying to think about economics and politics together in the imperial setting. You know, I think the idea of the two contexts in which the political motivation is the primary driver for economic theory and economic policy is very interesting. One is local, based on race in the Far East. The other is based on the nationalizing imperial regime and is in the center and connected to the protective tariffs, basically of the Alexander III reign. But let me ask you, are we completely done with the idea that the protectionism and the protective tariffs was a genuinely creative policy measure in order to develop industry in the emerging global economic competition of industrial economies? You know, I had a feeling that we completely kind of threw away this idea to say that there could have been other ways of developing it, or it was a politically motivated gesture without any economic rationale. And maybe just to fine-tune this idea, we might think that the tariff system as a developmental measure is indeed based on the economic knowledge that presumes the space of a state and economy to be homogeneous, to be like a nation state. And therefore, any protective tariff policy is likely to highlight the differences, the regional differences within the complex spaces that are not nation states, but empires, and are characterized of economic and economic growth differences. I have just one more question to Sergey Glebov. In the visual presentation and also in your paper, you do stress, you really unpack and explore how the Chinese body has become the main problem and the main tool of assessment of the economic problem in the Far East, in the eye of those merchants who wanted to identify with the Russian trade interest and economic interest, even though they're far from that. It seems like this discourse and your presentation, which is a criticism of your paper, I have to do that, it seems like it's missing some of the representative of the Chinese commerce that are very well-to-do, were actually admitted to congresses convened by the Governor General, and by social status they were visible. They were not exactly resembling these merchants, peddlers, a low trade that you've showed. We know at least one, Yun Hozan, from actually your research and research of Alexander Turbin. So, please address this question: to what extent there is a complete neglect of social stratification within the Chinese trading community? And the sub-question of that is the fact that apart from the Chinese trade, there is a Chinese labor in the Far East. And this is the bloodline of the construction and many projects that are done in the Far East. And at least, a sympathetic discourse to that, to the economic assessment of the economic situation in the Far East says we need to allow the Chinese trade because we do have a Chinese labor, and then they sort of create an autonomous circuit and they function nicely, and we need to keep the cost of the Chinese labor low. For that reason, it might be working, even if theoretically it's against the idea of a national economy and autarky and the prevalence of the Russian interest in the commerce. So maybe you can address this point in your answers. And ChiaYin Su, I have a number of questions on that, but I think one question would be to ask you about the Chinese-Russian later in your period after 1905 is the Russian-Asian Bank, a very interesting structure that is in your paper, but I guess what I would be interested to know is more of a perspective, not just from the management of the Eastern Chinese Railroad, but from the perspective of the operator of the bank. That is, of course, very interesting because 61% of the shares, and I wonder if that's the case for the period of 1917, 1918, 1919, you're talking about, they are Société Générale, right? So it's a French loan. In fact, the French capital, the French capital helped save the Russian-Chinese bank when it was completely bankrupt over the loss of Dalny and the southern Manchuria and the loss of the Russo-Japanese War. So are we here?
Sasha, I'm very sorry, just one more minute and then absolutely it.
So the question is, given that the shares are in Paris, do you have Horvat operating vis-a-vis the Omsk government, or do you have also the more global connection that is at the foundation of the bank? And the final question is that I wonder if you tried to check the currency exchange as a way of prognosis and a way of prediction of the successful effort of the anti-Bolshevik movements. You mentioned that it's usually, the depreciation of the currency is usually after the battle is lost. But I wonder if you can sort of look at the currency value, the exchange value, and also look at the political prognosis and how people assess the odds of of the Russian Civil War. And I thank all the presenters for wonderful papers. Thank you.
Thank you, Sasha. So to save time, I'm going to unmute our those who registered to ask questions. James Meador would be the first, and our presenters will collect questions, and then I will ask you to answer all of them together. So James, go ahead, please. Oh, I'm sorry. Am I?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I have a question for Sergey and for ChiaYin. Sergey, I guess I'm just curious in hearing a little bit more about the relationship between Chinese bodies and Chinese forms of life. I was very struck by this quote you have from one of these merchant sort of petitions, talking about the threat of being turned into a manza. This is, a little bit of hyperbole, certainly, but I just wonder if really bodies are what are at stake here, or if maybe it's body in some sort of more cultural and less biological sense. Anyway, I just wanted to hear what you would have to say about that point. And then for ChiaYin, I've run into a term used in Chinese sources from the period, I guess maybe before and maybe after you're talking about, called it qiangtie. It's a term used to refer to Russian money. And I'm not sure if you've encountered this term, know of its sort of etymology or what its designation is. So anyway, if you just heard of that term, anything you know about it. Thank you.
Thank you. And now, Andrei Schlachter, right? So I'm unmuting you. Andrei, please go ahead. No, you should unmute. Okay. You don't have to unmute. I'm doing this. Okay. No, for some reason I can't unmute you. Elena, can you help me? I'm trying to
unmute himself.
Hmm?
I think he does probably have to unmute himself at the same time.
Okay, Andrei, you are now on mute. Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. Yeah, my comment is for Sergey. I really enjoyed your paper, but I'd like to stand up for the Russian imperial administrators and local merchants that I feel are perhaps a little bit maligned. Not stand up for them not as actors, but as observers, right? So as you very persuasively document, they consistently refer to the Chinese as what you say, somatically different, that the Chinese could afford to eat less, to dress shabbily, to live in squalor. But I would like to suggest that, what if what these observers, and they're not disinterested observers, but nonetheless observers, what if what they're describing was actually true, right? And to echo James's comment that this has less to do with bodies, perhaps, but with cultural experience and with the experience of what these Chinese migrants had left behind in Manchuria and perhaps further back in Shandong, where they might have come from. And so in relative terms, this is something of an improvement over the conditions they left behind. And I'm not suggesting that we share the value judgment placed by the Russian observers, which was obviously very hierarchical, and cast all of this as signs of cultural inferiority of the Chinese. But we could see the same things and treat them as kind of scrappiness and hardiness and so on. And even more heretically, a little along the same lines, what if the parallels that the observers drew with the Jews in the Western borderlands were not the product of prejudice, but actual sociological reality, right? I'm thinking here of Yuri Slyoskin's framework, which would cast both the Jews in the Western borderlands and the Chinese in the East as Mercurians, right? And both groups derived their strength from ethnic networks, from what locals might unsympathetically call clannishness. And this was a source of both their success and a predictable source of resentment everywhere, right? So I guess what I'm saying is need not undercut your argument, which I think is quite persuasive, but I guess I'm calling for a less ironic stance towards your subject, perhaps. So.
Okay, thank you. Chuck Stenvedel. Chuck, I'm unmuting you right now. Go
Can you
ahead.
hear me? Am I unmuted?
Yes, 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 you are.
Yes. I want to be quick. I want to thank all three of the presenters and Sasha for the commentary. I had more questions, but I'll focus it on two because of time. The first question was for ChiaYin. I thought it was really fascinating, the idea of looking at currencies in a time of civil war and revolution, because I think as Sasha points out, there's a real sense that, you know, if you think about you know, the value of a currency and what it says about your ideas of a regime. That is that the Romanov currency still has value long after the Romanovs have gone. And I think this gets to a point that I guess I would take a bit of issue with your idea of speculation. That is speculation as being something that's beyond economic rationality. I mean, I think, you know, and I mean, economists like to see economic rationality everywhere, but I think if we look at our own time, our own last few months, that, you know, the values, even at a time when we have massive computing and ability to digest economic information, much more than they had in 1919, the markets go up and down continually. That is, there's so much that's not economic rationality in the short run, at least. And so I think, you know, I guess I would push it a little bit on this connection. I mean, certainly there is something about supply and demand of these notes, and that's a sort of economic calculation. But I think this Civil War moment might be just sort of writ large. What markets often face is that there's a large, you know, subjective component, especially if we look at any particular time. The other question I had was for Sergey, and that's, I mean, there are a lot of questions I had for Sergey, but the one that struck me is the Kunst und Albers as the sort of, you know, as part of this Russian nationalizing empire. I mean, it's such a, you know, it's such a non-Russian name with a Prussian born representative. I'm just wondering, to what extent is this imperial frontier a kind of just a truly cosmopolitan zone? And not that the rest of the empire isn't, but that do we see on these borderlands a particular concentration of you know, a sense that this is an open market, that you can be, you know, the representative of a German company in the Russian Empire on the border with China. Is there something particular about the sort of borderlands of empire in this regard? Or is this just sort of an isolated incident that I'm making too much of? Thank you.
All right, and so we have 3 questions from YouTube. Should we unmute Ilya Gerasimov? Ilya, who is going to ask those questions? So if this is sub Imperio, Ilya, then yeah. Okay, yeah. So please go. Can you unmute yourself? No, you shouldn't unmute yourself.
Mute me again.
So you, yeah.
It's not from YouTube. It's actually my question. Can
I sorry, I didn't realize. Go ahead.
Yeah, very briefly, I have a question. First of all, to Blessy. I really like your focus on tariffs as a political statement, as a language communicating priorities and visions of the future. So, reading this language, what does it say about the inner dynamics of the empire looked from this economic perspective? In 1922, the intra-imperial trade overall, including colonies and dominions, stood at about 30%. I mean, the exports, the trade within the empire, this intra-imperial trade occupied 30%. Today in the European Union, the average rate is about 65%, twice as high. And some countries have 83, 84%. The share of trade is from the European Union. So compared to this non-formal imperial political union, British Empire, even in 1922, which is a high point in your sampling in time period, was, I mean, a very loose organization, I would say, economic union. what does it tell us about the success of attempts to reach high imperial cohesion and interest and progress in this direction? To Sergey Glebov, race, as we know, is supposed to be an imperial phenomenon, right? Historically. And yet, in your story, we see a race in the context of imperializing, nationalizing empire, globalization, economic globalization, homogenization, national homogenization, Russian Empire, unification. So it's a response to this trend, counterbalancing this trend towards unification, homogenization, and perhaps coming as a reaction, the response to this economic globalizing and unifying trend. And I wonder how race entangled with class, how it masks class, as we know, is normal to race in the nowadays. Was the role of class coded as race in the Far East? And to ChiaYin, I see the paradox in the story that you told. We think about frontier and Eastern Siberia, and particularly Manchuria is, of course, this double frontier zone. And when you think about money in the frontier, you think about, gold coins that you check with your teeth for, I think, right, for, to check the authenticity of the coin. And yet, in this case, we see people operating with fidelity money. Look at the currencies that the Russian bourse prefer. They had all this phantom currency. It's Romanov ruble, and from before, I mean, there is no emperor, no empire. The state will be no longer. Anybody knows that. But this is like hard currency. I can understand US dollar, although it's to be popular. But where is the America, and where is, I mean, it's still ironic. And Chinese dollar is also probably not the most reliable currency in 1919. You mentioned the depreciation of the currency, but I mean, they printed this crudely produced paper strips in tremendous numbers, and they still depreciated what, like 10 times 10 in your table. It's like 40 times for Romanov ruble, 200 for Kerenka. Well, yes, it's significant, but think about the Soviet ruble of the time, issued by the sovereign government that nationalized economy and in control of all the resources of the country. Inflation runs over the same period that Romanov ruble of the non-existent state depreciated by 40 times. Soviet ruble is like millions and billions by 1922. So we see that, yes, it's expected to be a frontier torn apart by political boundaries, social, Chinese don't like Russians, Russians don't like Chinese, but somehow in the language of, and again, if we take economy as a language of self-description, self-representation, we see that this is the most integrated space, maybe even in Eastern Central Europe. Think about German hyperinflation in the early 20s, right? People having trust in this fidelity money. How come and why? What does it tell us about the situation on the ground in society? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now I would invite our participants to respond, perhaps in the same order as wow, why muted? Am I unmuted now? Can you hear me? Okay, so we start with Blessy and try to stay within, well, I know it's unrealistic, but like within 7 minutes. seven, 10 minutes maximum, but 7 minutes, yeah.
Okay.
So Blessy,
Thank
please.
you. Thank you. I'll just start with the first question that I got from the chair. Basically, I think the first part of your question talks about the global circulation of these ideas of tariff and protectionism, and whether if I'm not wrong, you're asking whether these ideas are derivative or not. Again, I they certainly draw influence from Friedrich Liss's study of the national economy and the role of tariff in developing industries that are necessary for national defense. But at the same time, they also draw back on the works of, say, Alexander Hamilton, a prominent 19th century politician who was in support of tariffs, as well as there's a great influence by I don't remember his full name, but Taussig, who is actually the chairman of the U.S. Tariff Commission. And the policies, the U.S. tariff policies, especially towards Canada, in terms of certain in the space of, in the consideration of certain industries like logging, dairy products, all of these form serious considerations for Britain. Especially these imperial conferences are actually organized because there is a bit of a fear from the British side that tariff concessions, if they are not granted, the colonies might pull away, especially the autonomous colonies like Canada might pull away just like the US. So you have even a free trader like Alfred Marshall, a prominent free trader who believes in these ideas of free trade policies, but also admits that England's tight surveillance of the colonies or on tariff matters is pretty old-fashioned, and that economies, these colonial economies, want to be at par with the British mother country. So he says that some kind of leeway has to be given to the free trade policy. But again, this is on one side. Back in India, we have a lot of local influences. So you have prominent Indian economists like Dadabhai Naoroji, R.C. Dutt, Radha Kamal Mukherjee, who are talking about this drain of Indian wealth from Indian economy to the British economy because of the pattern of the Indian trade, which I'll also try to combine it with the question on monetary standard. So basically what happens is that India has a positive trade of balance with the rest of the world and a negative balance of trade with Britain. And this is a sort of an artificial kind of commercial setup, which is meant to produce a surplus balance of trade, which can be used to pay India's debt obligations with Britain. So obviously, India remains in debt obligations. India remains in a negative balance of trade with Britain till the end of the First World War. Until 1918, where Britain has a negative balance of trade with India. And this surplus trade that is generated, it is artificially generated. In fact, you have times when India is having massive famines in the 1890s and early 1900s and still exporting food grains and having positive trade surplus. So you can see that most of the resources that are being taken out of India and most of the income generation is not being put back into Indian investment, but is actually shifted to meet debt obligations in the form of the gold standard reserve and the Indian currency reserve. And this has been very, very famously called and highly debated by the Indian economists, contemporary Indian economists of that time, as drain of wealth. And it's very controversial. And from this drain of wealth, they're also inspired by ideas of List, Friedrich List, the success of Japan, as well as the success of the US, and they try to combine these ideas. And so what you have is, again, a tariff strategy that may be derivative in some points, but is actually a complex mix of personal ambitions, aspirational goals, and of course, using economic principles as a justification to these kind of political aspirations. I hope that I have partially answered this question. Coming back to India's monetary standard, again, it's a very complicated question. In fact, it would rather require a whole book on it. But because of India's position as a crown colony, again, Indian monetary system is highly under surveillance. In fact, it is much more under surveillance than is the tariff system. So Indian currency, which is which is in silver, is pegged at an artificial rate to the British sterling at so that 1 pound is equivalent to 15 rupees, and this exchange rate is artificially maintained throughout the war, and any kind of any kind of shortcoming or any kind of due to any kind of problems that arises from moving away from this fixed rate of exchange causes a lot of problems, because here is where the context of an artificial trade surplus that comes in, because in order to fulfill certain trade debt obligations, you have to maintain a certain amount of surplus trade, and a certain amount of surplus trade can only be maintained if you have a fixed exchange rate. If Indian rupee appreciates in any way, and mostly because most Indian goods are Indian exports are raw materials which can be easily substituted. Because of that, there is an important necessity to fix these exchange rates. Otherwise, this would affect India's ability to pay back these debt obligations. In fact, one important during the war, India is actually during the war, Britain actually tries to divert all the gold payments coming to India to Britain, because Britain herself is actually suffering from a currency crisis at this time, and moreover, it is actually indebted to the US. So what it does is that in order to fulfill its debt obligation with US, it tries to increase India's exports to the US, and gets the US to pay back India not in gold but in silver currency, so that India's demand for silver currency does not lead to an appreciation, because India was known as a sink of metals. So it was feared that if India took too much silver or gold, it would lead to an overall inflation of metal prices. So you see that here UK is trying to fulfill its American debt obligations by getting India to sell more to UK and use that surplus revenue to support British treasuries and to pay back some of the US debts. So you can see that this is a very complex, circular and highly controlled monetary system. But I will say one thing, that is why in my research I have noticed that by 1920s, with the loosening of fiscal control, monetary control actually becomes much more tighter. So there is some kind of a bargaining. And again, you will see that protectionism given is not a full kind of protectionism. It's very selective protectionism that again does not mess with the larger structure of the Indian trade economy. And the last question, second last question, where I was asked about the British India as a unit and the princely states. I am not focusing on the princely states. Again, it's very complicated. Not very complicated, because again, it brings me into the focus of land trade and inter-empire trade. I'm basically focusing on sea customs trade, and my focus mainly on British India, and within British India, basically three provinces which were majorly important: Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras. Bombay is the most important because Bombay has the Bengal precedence. The Bombay is most important because it has all the big cotton mills, big industries in 1922 cotton mills. Bengal is important because it was the early pioneer of industries, and the iron and steel industry is also in the first iron and steel industry of India in 1907 is also established in the Bengal presidency, and the Madras presidency, which is initially important, but not as important as Bombay and Bengal. I am trying to concentrate on how each of these presidencies are trying to are impacted by these debates. And there are smaller provinces, but usually these provinces used to follow follow the lead of the Bombay and Bengal presidency. My larger research actually went down into the nitty-gritties, but of course I had to cut it because of the presentation time. And lastly, talking about the cohesion of the empire. Talking about the cohesion, just one more minute, Marina, sorry. Talking about the cohesion of the empire, the German Zollverein is I mean, the German Zollverein, which is like this cohesion of the German states that happens in the early 18th, late 18th, 19th, late 18th century. There is a vision by Joseph Chamberlain to create something similar, like a similar commercial union for Britain and her colonies. But unfortunately, it doesn't work out because, of course, the Liberal Party in Britain, the ruling Liberal Party in Little Britain, does not see any advantage to it. But with the end of the First World War, there are attempts to reconsolidate the empire under the Balfour Committee. But it isn't very successful. It's only by the 1930s that Britain starts actually taking a keen interest in wanting to keep its colonies together on a commercially beneficial relationship. I'll discuss this I'll discuss this further if I can discuss this, because I know my time is almost up. So maybe I can discuss this with you on mail. But anyways, thank you for the question, because it will come back in my later research.
Thank you. So Sergey, it's your turn.
Okay, I'll try to be very, very brief. And a few questions actually are related to each other. Sasha's point about certain kinds of Chinese merchants who are very privileged and sort of incorporated into the imperial structures. More or less, Ilya's point about race and class. I can't believe you said the word class, but I'd be interested to know more about what you mean by class in this context. And Andrei's point about the sociological reality, invoking Yuri Sloskin's work on the Jewish century and the idea of the Mercurians. The sociological reality was that there was a certain pyramid, right? And the more we go down that pyramid, the greater the number of Chinese merchants and the greater prevalence in daily life, right? Excuse me. The trade in the Russian Far East was dominated by a few trading houses, massive trading houses like Kunst and Albers, which, as Chuck Steinwedel pointed out, is a German company based in Hamburg and run by a Prussian subject who lives in Vladivostok and becomes Russian subject later on. The number of Chinese merchants increases, especially if we go down from the first guild, the second guild, to those merchants who just buy 6-month permits, 12-month permits for retail trade. And so the sociological reality is not that the trade is dominated by the Chinese or that they're super efficient in trade. It's that at a certain level, there is a niche which is much easier for the Chinese merchants to fulfill than for the Russian merchants for a number of reasons. And of course, the comparison with Jews is interesting because we know Jews are the internal other in the Russian Empire. Right? There is an established trope, there is a way of talking and thinking about the internal other, and that way of thinking and talking is imported into the colonial borderland. I strongly suspect that it was also influenced by the fact that in 1891-92, exactly when these petitions are lodged by the merchants, there is a largely failed campaign to deport Jews into the Pale of Settlement from Siberia. It's actually, we don't really know much about that campaign, but it did exist. The sort of question that James Meador asked about the relationship between the Semitic and the cultural, and I think it comes up in other questions as well. Indeed, this is an interesting boundary, right? When does the Semitic description of race become a culturalist issue? The boundary is not stable, right? But this is one of the cases where we can actually say that it becomes a trope. By 1900, it's a trope, a cliche in the Russian Far East that the Chinese are less demanding in terms of their physical bodies. They can live off things that Russians can't live off, right? And there is also a trope, also kind of extended to the Chinese labor, that it's cheap because of the particularity of its body, but less productive. that you pay them less because they produce less, because their bodies are very different, right? This becomes an established trope, and one of the few tropes actually in the Russian Empire where it's so focused on somatic elements. And so I suspect that it's an impact of sort of circulating discourses on race, both globally and locally in the empire, which is kind of, you know, kind of transformed to this camera obscura of a petty merchant's consciousness in the imperial borderland. And then, yeah, I think your question about race and class is partly all answered by this notion of the pyramid, right? By the fact that 2 or 3 highly visible Chinese merchants, like Tifan Tai, for example, Zifan Tai, a very prominent merchant who became the supplier of the Russian army during the Russo-Japanese War, built a massive fortune. That these people, of course, remain an exception throughout this pyramid. There are a couple of them on top, but the more we go to the bottom, the fewer of them are there. So these are sort of the questions I had, and I'm going to give the floor to ChiaYin.
Thank you, Sergey.
Thank you very much all for your questions, and I too will try to be fast. Thanks very much to Alexander Semyonov for your questions. And I want to say that, yes, that's very valid to point out that the Russo-Asiatic Bank was based in Paris, that the shareholders were largely French. And in fact, to address that, I could say that the Russo-Asiatic Bank operating in Harbin decided to abandon the Sibirki about quite a bit earlier than the Chinese Eastern Railway. So in that sense, you could say that the bank's shareholders are more interested in saving the ruble as a whole to save their investment, but not necessarily committed to Sibirki as a currency. Then your question about currency value and political prognosis. Well, for one thing, political prognosis itself is a fairly subjective activity. And just to show that the two don't really quite correspond, I will say that even as the Red Army was winning territories and winning battles, the Sovsnaki's exchange rate was dropping further and further, below everything else, below the Romanovs, way below the Kerenki, and so on. So the two don't really quite match. There's a reason for that dynamic, and it hasn't got too much to do with political prognosis. To James Muildor's question about Changtie, I think this points to a very interesting fact. The term Chang refers to Russian, foreign and Russian. Tie refers to paper notes, money, paper money. And it's a commonly used term. All the money used in Manchuria is basically paper money. They're all tie. So all the diao are different kinds. Heilongjiang tie and the Jilin tie, right? They're all called notes. What it means is that nobody actually carries around real metal or coins. And what gives those paper notes value is that they're convertible when desired into their metal base to silver or to gold. Those paper notes will lose value when they are no longer convertible. So even though no one actually converts the money into the actual metal, knowing that it can be converted gives those paper notes value. And of course, the fact that most people don't end up converting leads to certain kind of abuses by the issuers, right? Hoping that people are not going to discover there's actually not a reserve beneath the paper money. But it shows you how often, how common it is that paper notes are used in this time. Okay, so to Ilya's question about frontier money and phantom currency, I think it is surprising, but basically all these paper value money, however shaky they may be, they are supposedly based on some kind of metal and supposedly convertible. And even when they seem to be very based on very little reserve, they're still needed. And even if their exchange value keeps dropping, they're still needed, because as long as you have commodity exchange, you're going to need money, some kind of medium of exchange to enable the circulation of money. So the problem that was occurring in Manchuria was that there was a lot of goods to be moved, but no money to help move the goods. So everybody's looking for money, money that doesn't exist anymore because governments have fallen and stopped issuing those money. And it turned out at this point, the Chinese dollar was a very strong money because the government was there. The government was building this money on a silver reserve and promised convertibility, even though not expecting to converting it, promising convertibility at a time when the ruble, in fact, couldn't be converted anymore. So finally, to Chuck Steinweddel's question about economic rationality and looking at currency in the time of war and revolution, I think this is sort of a problem I'm trying to look into about what kind of economic activities are out there and which kinds can be called rational or not rational. And I think in the time of war and revolution, it's easier to see that certain activities are just beyond kind of rational explanation or seem to follow no predictable pattern that they simply cannot be anticipated or predicted. There's no way to do that. So it's easier to see that in war and revolution, but for someone like Frank Knight, he believes that those kinds of economic activities exist every day, that there are aspects of our economic activities that we call economic that are entirely unpredictable. You really don't know what their outcome is going to be. And those kind of situations he calls uncertainty. The kind of uncertainty, the kind of unpredictable futures that just simply goes beyond the economic rationality. In that case, the only way to deal with that is a kind of inspiration, you can almost say, in his case. The only way to deal with that is a kind of inspiration that comes from judgment, but not economic rationality. And so he talks about that for economic activities in general. I focus on war and revolution because it seems to highlight that and it's easier to focus on that. But what lies behind all of this is that, in fact, because what it points to is that what lies behind the value of money is really, in a way, only confidence and trust. So in a way, money is inherently artificial. It really depends on something else to make it worthwhile. And that artificiality is in a way, at the basis of it, beyond economic rationality.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all. So now I perhaps need Sergey's instructions. So I think that we are, out of time. We can continue informally. We were promised Zoom coffee or Zoom lunch or Zoom dinner or whatever. Anyway, but I think that this was very interesting, and I'm just wondering, should we continue discussion, or Sergey, we should wrap up?
Well, I think we should wrap up because we promised people that we would finish around 6 p.m. Moscow time, and we didn't. We took a bit more time. I think tomorrow we will not use the chat by the chair to send messages about timing, because when you're presenting, it turns out it's very hard to see.
Everyone just ignores the chair, so
right.
It's better to use a mic.
So I'm guilty as charged. So we are going to just use the mic to convey the message that the time is over, is that we are running out of time, sense. And we should have a better discipline in terms of time management next time. But I wanted to thank you all for joining us, and we will reconvene tomorrow at 4 p.m. Moscow time for another set of really fascinating papers. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Elena, one more point. Of course, I wanted to, there is nothing that we can use as a kind of a social space here, but I would encourage people to get in touch and schedule Zoom appointments and have a coffee if you would like to talk to each other.
So now you're talking.
I know you could always do that, but I just wanted to encourage that. We don't have couloirs of the conference, so it's up to us to create those across space. All right? Okay. And now we can really end the meeting. Thank you and see you tomorrow.
Thank you.
Elena, would you be so kind to end the meeting?
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, we can simply leave the meeting.
Илья, скажите, пожалуйста, я останавливаю вещание?
Да.
Да.